Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the February 2022 session of the Erie County Workforce Collaborative Training Series. The Erie County Department of Mental Health is so happy to be able to offer these trainings to the dedicated providers in our community to support workforce retention and provide an opportunity for individuals from our provider community to share their expertise. Today, we are so excited to have Christopher Frigon to talk with us about Cluster B personality types, the Dramatic-Erratic group, overview and focus on borderline personality. In March, we're happy to announce that the topic will be Problem Gambling 101. And for the March session, the presenters from the Problem Gambling Resource Center are able to offer free continuing ed credits for CASACs and social work, which we are very excited about. I'll put the link for the registration for the March session in the chat at the end of this session. I'll also be sending out an announcement later today, or you can go to the erie.gov/mental-health website for announcements and registration information. All of the sessions are the fourth Tuesday of the month from noon to 1, and I'd encourage you to mark your calendars and watch for notices for future events. All of the presentations and recordings for the past offerings are posted on our website, and I encourage you to check those out as well. And please tell your friends. At the end of this session, we'll be asking you to complete a very brief evaluation. We hope you'll take a moment to fill this out so we can continue to improve. This is a community collaborative, and we're always looking for volunteers to share their expertise with our community of providers. If you're interested in doing a 1-hour presentation or are interested in a particular topic, you can indicate that in the evaluation or contact me, Amy Rockwood, at amy.rockwood@erie.gov. This training will be recorded. Everyone is muted, so if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. Kathleen Larson from the Erie County Department of Mental Health will be monitoring the chat for us during the session. I apologize, my camera isn't now working, but I'm here. Thank you all for joining us today, and I'd like to now introduce Christopher Frigon for his presentation on Cluster B personality types, the Dramatic-Erratic group, overview and focus on borderline personality. Thanks so much for being here, Chris, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Kathleen, for having me on. I appreciate it. So yeah, we're going to start kind of big picture. The Cluster B personalities, what are they? And then drill right down to, I think, the focus that people wanted to really listen or talk about with borderline personality. And hopefully, there's plenty of time at the end for some questions. So we'll start by defining what is borderline personality disorder. We're going to look at it from a couple of different places, actually. And then the approaches, interventions. This probably is the heart and soul of any interest in BPD. What do you do? And then I think self-care is equally as important. What do you do? Because this population, frankly, can be difficult, not because they intend, but because they struggle with a lot of things. And we're going to have to walk through kind of the hierarchy of intervention, like where do you start, speaking directly about risk. So let's start with the 4 distinct personality types that are organized by what the DSM calls descriptive similarities. And these similarities would separate the Cluster B group from A, which is known as the odd-eccentric, and C, which is known as the anxious avoidant. But the general requirements for all personality subtypes: cultural norm deviation. This is really, really super important. People in a culturally relative way have to recognizably think differently, express their emotion differently, act interpersonally in odd ways, and have impulse control issues that are not normative to the culture. What I find fascinating is the last really 2 years, like what is the cultural expression through the filter of surviving a pandemic, frankly. Interesting to me. But in general, the pattern that we have to see with these things is inflexible and pervasive, meaning it tends to stay at the same baseline, even when change is introduced. People don't engage often in new tactics. They keep going back to the same problem-solving techniques or ways of thinking, ways of expressing emotion, and it's pervasive. It isn't just with, say, me, like the one person finds me to be a jerk, so they, treat me as such. No, it's pervasive. It's around all people, all situations, work, home, school. So not just a unique person-to-person phenomenon. It causes clinically significant distress in the person. And what does that mean? A lot of folks think about difficult personalities as maybe creating distress for people around them. While that might be true, I would suggest, and part of really understanding and caring about how to work with these folks is understanding they are in enormous pain all the time. You may not see it, but these folks are getting chronically invalidated everywhere they go. And it's a really frustrating way to live. These symptoms are stable, meaning unchanging, and of long duration. And this is an important piece of the required ability to assess in order to diagnose. Professionally, I am very conservative around diagnosing these things, and the long duration requirement is a big part of it. While I can appreciate and understand why people do what I would call kind of heuristic diagnosing, meaning one symptom presents today and therefore that's, clearly evidence of, I don't find that to be truly a great way to go about diagnosing, but I get how that helps people to identify, symptoms that could be problematic. But understand we need to be finding duration as part of our, client presentation of symptoms in order to diagnose. And of course, like most mental health issues cannot be accounted for by other better. So a medical issue or a substance issue or frankly, other mental health. So what are cluster B? Well, there's 4: antisocial, histrionic, narcissistic, and borderline. And we'll kind of walk through all 4 of those just to get a little bit of a differential feel. The antisocial personality, these are all DSM statistics, meaning the diagnosis and statistical manual, right? I'm sorry, I have the 4 at home. 5 is still at that other office that I can't get to. At any rate, the DSM talks about in the general population, about 3% of men, 1% of women carry this personality type. And in the clinical population, it presents more often, 3 to 30%. It's going to be setting dependent, meaning there are simply some settings that will filter more in, accounting for that higher rate. The core feature, a disregard for and violation of the rights of others. And interestingly, the DSM ensures these folks also have to be 18 with evidence of conduct disorder before age 15. Doesn't mean they have to have the diagnosis, but you need to be able to search up the evidence to arrive at, they had conduct disorder pattern behaviors going on before age 15. And of course, it can't occur exclusively during the course of schizophrenia manic episode. What are the rest of the criteria from the DSM? A failure to conform to social norms, meaning law, the legal social norms. Deceitful, impulsive, irritable and aggressive, reckless, disregard for others, high levels of irresponsibility, and a lack of remorse. Now that presents in one of 2 ways. Indifferent, they really don't care, or rationalizing, meaning they will give you the reasons why they did the bad thing and why the other person's pain kind of doesn't matter as much as their reason for having contributed to that pain. Histrionic personality in the general population also fairly common. I know you're thinking 2 to 3%, that's not common. No, it's not, if you think about it just that way. But it's a lot of people by sheer number. Just when you do the math and you start to realize, like if you were to add up the prevalence rates from the DSM for all 10 of the personality disorder diagnoses, you arrive at a range of 16 to 20%. And then when you just kind of do the math, the local area, Buffalo, 400,000 or so, it literally means you could fill whatever they're calling the Buffalo Bills Stadium these days. You could fill that at any time with just people from our local area that meet at least one, full criteria for one of these diagnoses. It's a very large number. In the clinical population, 10 to 15%, the core feature is this pervasive and excessive emotionality and attention seeking. However, it doesn't always present, in that fun-loving kind of thing that I think a lot of folks heuristically think of when they think of histrionic personality. It actually presents in a much different way clinically. These folks do tend to get uncomfortable when they're not the center of attention, inappropriately seductive, provocative, And here is the part that really shows up in my experience in clinic settings. The rapid and shallow emotion combined with, they will use their physical appearance, but this excessively impressionistic or shallow way of thinking. So shallow emotion and shallow thought. These folks do not connect A to B to C well at all. They have a very difficult time explaining how they got to certain conclusions about things. A lot of logical fallacy in their thinking that you'll pick up on. And then, in a clinical setting, what differentiates that from borderline, we'll talk about a little later, because it does help with the confusion between kind of the overlap of these four types. What else does histrionic do? Well, self-dramatization, easily suggestible, and they tend to consider relationships to be more intimate than other people would consider them to be, meaning the other person in the relationship, so to speak. The narcissistic personality, generally speaking, I would say this statistic probably surprises people. It's one of the less common personality disorder types. Per the DSM, less than 1% of the general population. But it's been in our social media a lot in the last 5 or so years. I don't know if that's, about anything in particular, but clearly I think people see that number and they think, whoa, there's a lot more of it out there than that. I don't know. I think there are a lot of heuristic narcissists out there, but I don't know about diagnosable DSM. Anyway, clinical population 2 to 16%, with a core feature being grandiosity, a need for admiration, and a lack of empathy. The connection between those three things. The DSM also looks for self-importance, preoccupation with fantasy, believing self to be special, the requiring of excessive admiration, sense of entitlement. These folks tend to be interpersonally exploitive, lacking empathy, excuse me, envious of others, believing others are envious of him or her, and then arrogant and haughty. Now, these three personality types have one thing in common that our last personality type does not share. Now, this is going to come from a perspective from treatment, and we'll have to talk in a little detail about where the idea comes from. But the three personalities we've talked about so far, what they share is a tendency to be manipulative. Now, I grant that exists on a continuum, but the antisocial, the narcissist, and the histrionic personality types do in fact engage, many of them, in varying levels of manipulation. Whereas this personality type, by definition, does not because they cannot. This is a really important way of thinking as a treatment provider, as a case manager, as a family member, that the interpretation of the intentionality of the person's behavior, we need to check our own perception of that a little bit when working with borderline on any level. If for no other reason that thinking this way helps you maintain your sense of, just call it level footing in interacting with what can be a difficult individual. In the general population, borderline personality presents about 2%, according to the DSM. The clinical population, 10 to 20. Now, that's where the DSM will diverge from many of our own, maybe clinical experiences. For example, some of you may work on a program that is 100% borderline personality because you do a treatment protocol called dialectical behavioral therapy, which is designed for maybe that group. Marsha Linehan, of course, had that kind of experience. She developed the treatment protocol many years ago. So the clinical population may vary, I would suggest higher from that 10 to 20%. At least my professional experience led me to believe that. What is the core feature for borderline personality? Instability of relationships, instability of self-image, instability of emotional expressivity, and marked impulsivity. In other words, instability. There is a cat coming in and out of my office, sorry. There is a noted pattern consistently of instability. The DSM talks about this as being frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. Now, here's where we start to get in a little bit of trouble with BPD. Just how do you objectively define, frantic, real or imagined, and what does abandonment mean to you versus to someone else? So the language itself here can can become a barrier to understanding this personality type. I want to stay aware of that because we're going to move later to a different model of looking at how to think about borderline personality and maybe how to diagnose differently. What else does the DSM talk about? Intense, unstable relationships, meaning this balance between idealizing, I love you, and devaluing, you're an awful human, right? There was a book from, I don't know, 80s or maybe late 70s, I Hate You, Don't Leave Me, right? This idea that these folks really do bounce between idealization and devaluation. Identity disturbance, like an ever-shifting sense of self, no consistency with who I am in the world. And then impulsivity in two of these areas, how they spend money, how they engage in sex, substance or process addiction use, reckless driving, binge eating. Recurrent suicidal behavior. So this could be acts with or without intent. And this would include self-mutilation or self-injurious behaviors. Affective instability due to marked reactivity of mood. So affective instability refers to lability, like this up and down of emotionality these folks experience. If you think about it, that would be a really painful way of being in the world. Just emotions constantly up and down, different ones all the time. With feelings of emptiness, you know, this kind of hollowed out part of self that nothing ever seems to fill to create meaning for that person in the world, who they are, what they're doing here. Inappropriate and intense anger or an inability to control their anger. Transient stress-related paranoia or severe dissociative experiences. Now, this piece here probably speaks to the history of the name of the personality, borderline personality. Very early, it was conceptualized as someone whose living experience was on the border between psychosis and neurosis. So the psychosis of dissociative experiences, the paranoid thinking patterns, versus the neuroses, you know, the anxiety or fear of people leaving me or, you know, hating me, so I get angry first, right? So that is some of the history of what the word borderline was intended to mean. But if we decide to really look at the group of people that kind of fall in this filtering in with the diagnoses, right? So who has 6 of 9 of those symptoms that would then be, I guess, given a diagnosis of borderline personality, you find remarkable inconsistency between people. In other words, borderline is not borderline is not borderline. They look and feel different, and that's going to mean that, you know, the treatment you decide to give, or hopefully try and work with someone on, you're going to have to adapt based on the individual you're working with. Now, Milan, let me let's go to DSM again, right? So this one book gives us every single mental health diagnosis. That's substance use, that's, you know, personality stuff, mood, psychotic disorders. Milan is a little different. Here's what the inside of the DSM looks like. Yeah. Okay. I know I'm like Carrot Top doing my props here. Here is Milan's book, roughly the same size, and the text is this double columned like font 8 thing. And all he talks about in this book, all he talks about is just personality. So just looking at that, you can probably imagine he gets in a little bit more detail. And frankly, I'm not a shill for Milan or his books, but oh my goodness, they're frankly fun to read. The way that he conceptualizes where personality disorder structure comes from, how it presents, you know, throughout the life course, and then his subtypes. This to me is the brilliance that really helps us understand who these folks are. He talks about very specific subtypes that will, in fact, I think, have face value in your work. Again, whatever you're doing with folks, it could be formal, you know, engaging in talk therapy, group therapy. It could be formally meeting with them in community settings, you know, doing case management work or recovery coaching. Whatever your role is, you'll see the differences between the people. So we're going to start big again with Milan. Borderline personality. He moves away from this idea of a cluster of dramatic, erratic, and talks about structurally defective personality types, which would then include the schizotypal personality, which just quickly is just like a very odd type of person in the world. The person may be wearing one of those, like, I don't know, funky hats with, like, I don't know, like a crazy flower sticking out of it, and I don't know, just they're odd, frankly. And then the paranoid personality, which is marked by an overt paranoia, very rigid people. And interestingly, they come from DSM's cluster A. So Milan sees similarities between these two cluster A personality types and borderline personality, and it's what he called structurally defective. So the words themselves, structurally and defective, meaning there's something wrong with how the individual personality domains operate. There's like nothing about them tends to be consistent, but broken, permeable in unpredictable ways. He talks about the adaptive inflexibility as a result. These folks are largely unable to consider options for how to be different. There's an old quote, I want to say it's Stephen Hawking. If I'm wrong, put it in the comments that, my memory's terrible, whatever. But I think he said intelligence can be defined by the ability to adapt to change, right? He's not talking about, personality types here as not being intelligent. But his idea was that intelligence isn't about a fund of information. It's about the ability to adapt, a fascinating concept. So helping people to break that adaptive inflexibility is going to be, call it a primary, like, process goal when working with borderline personality where this is a problem. Also looking at what Milan called the self-perpetuating vicious circles, meaning the self-fulfilling prophecy. Folks tend to do things that create the very thing they're trying to avoid. So I'm so afraid that my wife will leave me that I become easily agitated. I get paranoid, and because I think everything is about her leaving me, and eventually I attack. So my explosive anger creates the very reason why she looks at me and goes, "No, we're done." Right? I so fear it that I accidentally create it. This is what Milan called the self-perpetuating vicious circles, and this tenuous emotional balance, because of the lability of mood, or I should say, of emotion within the mood. Things are way out of balance, and it's a struggle to help the person find balance. We'll talk about how Linehan does that with DBT in a bit. So Milan goes far enough to say that the lack of the utility of the term borderline really is part of the problem. It doesn't describe the clinical presentation, so he proposed other ways of maybe describing these personality types, subtypes. The ambivalent personality, the erratic personality, the impulsive personality, or the quixotic personality. And just by, again, face value, the words themselves really do nicely, accurately describe kind of the subtypes that he was looking at. But the idea that the term borderline itself no longer has the utility that it maybe once did, I think is such a reasonable place to start in thinking about how we think about the borderline personality itself. You'll notice throughout this, I tend to avoid the word disorder except when I am maybe quoting from the DSM. It's not that I don't like the word, it's that I don't necessarily like how it's used and maybe what can be implied by that. A personality type, it's just to me about functioning level. We might see people that do not meet full criteria for a disorder. That does not mean that their features don't need to be addressed. They do. Those features, by theory, are still the things that are driving the other behavioral health issues that brought folks to treatment to begin with, whether it's drinking, spending, gambling, mood stuff. So the features absolutely need to be understood. And I said earlier, I'm really slow, to put the code down for a disorder. And in some cases, I never even arrive at it. The work for me is really about honing in on features. and helping people mm, to adapt their feature into something more functional for them in their world. So speaking of, Milan talks about diagnostic domains. In other words, how are our mental worlds or psyches, how can they be broken down, categorized? Now, I'll also grant a lot of this, of course, is going to be idiosyncratic to how you view personality. There's many models of personality, like the ocean model, right? The way Milan looks at it, and the way he took all of what he called the disorders, he plugged in um, presentation styles into this model, and then arrived at this for the borderline personality. Their expressive behavior, how they are with others, tends to be what he calls spasmodic, right? So it's very herky-jerky. It's, in a sense, unpredictable. Their interpersonal conduct with those folks is paradoxical or unpredictable. Their cognitive style, it's on the whim, it's capricious. It could be anything, anytime, what they tend to think. Very often as a reflection of a symptom like fearing abandonment. Their self-image, uncertain. They don't know who they are. There was a movie from the, I believe, late 80s, early 90s, which created a bit of a, today we would probably call it a meme. I don't know what we called it back then, but people would literally say, hey man, you're getting single white female. The movie was single white female, or a young lady moves next door to someone else and then started taking on that woman's appearance and mannerisms, right? This often happens with folks who don't have a stable self-image. It's what's called the development of introjects, where I take on the values of important people to me. Just take a look at any 3-year-old during football season wearing a Bills jersey. They're not Bills fans. They don't even know what the Bills are. But they are dad fans and mom fans. So, yep, they're proud of their jersey. They're introjecting a value non-consciously. They're not old enough to consider. And that's perfectly fine. But imagine being 35 and doing that, taking on values of people that you run into as a means of trying to connect with them. Well, clearly you're going to be changing values a lot. And it's going to be difficult for other people to understand about who you are. And then that, of course, creates the awareness, I don't know who I am either. Object representations tend to be incompatible. They hate people they love. They know that important people are supposed to be loved, and yet they have different feelings for them. There's an incompatibility in their mind about who the objects of their world are. Regulatory mechanisms regressed, meaning what do folks do when they are trying to cope with pain? Folks with borderline personality types tend to regress. They use younger version of themselves coping mechanisms. Morphologic organization is split. They cannot maintain a sense of gray about, good behavior, bad behavior. Good people do bad things, bad people do good things. It has to be one or the other. So that very black and white way of believing about people. And the mood and temperament, as we talked about a little earlier, labile. Ooh. Ooh. Okay, Milan subtypes. Discouraged. This is the sad, depressed, tending to be submissive, fear-based, insecure, helpless, hopeless, with brief periods of cheer, anger outbursts, resentment, fury. The interesting piece of this is that brief periods of cheer. It seems incompatible with the borderline personality type that we see in the world if we only think about like the diagnostic criteria. But in the real world, yeah, this is what happens with folks. They're not this one stable thing all the time. They can be paradoxically happy when you wouldn't expect them to be. There's something happening in those domains where the person is experiencing something in an unexpected way. The impulsive type, capricious, superficial, seductive, very evasive, meaning vague with people. Worry turns to agitation, which turns to gloom. They start looking and feeling hypomanic. But what was once exciting is now bleak. They just have this like disappointed way of being in the world, but want to not be that way. The petulant subtype, this is one of the ones that presents, I would say, a lot, but not as much as the last. But this is the extremely unpredictable person, defiant, disgruntled, angry, discontent, sullen, pessimistic. This is the negative Nelly with the rage, as opposed to maybe the negativity that you might see in a more dependent personality who's afraid to be angry, but they tend to still be very negativistic. This person will swing from rage to them pleading for forgiveness. And again, unpredictable. A silly little example of that, if I can share, is early in my career, and I didn't know what I was looking at half the time, more than half the time. But I'm talking to someone, and I was trying to do some reflective listening on what the individual had said, which seemed like an inconsistency about an identification of a problem and the proposed solution that the person was walking through. So I did some reflective listening, meaning I reflected back what I heard and questioned how, like, show me how that would help you, right? And the response I got back was loud and very close. Like, this person had never gotten so close to me that I was ever aware. And right in my face just said, there's only 5 people in all of Buffalo qualified to treat me, and you're not one of them. Whoa, that blew my hair back. I had no idea what this one was talking about. So I did the absolutely wrong thing. I thought I was being helpful. I thought I was trying to normalize. And I said, well, actually, there's 5 in this building alone that are qualified. I'm not sure where you're going. Man, I didn't know what I was saying. I didn't know what I was doing. I violated the most important thing to do with an individual like this, which we're going to call the chief dialectic in a little bit. So my intention, by the way, probably wasn't even that good. I'm sure I felt defensive and, oh my God, really, I'm getting attacked for trying to be helpful, but whatever. That's called countertransference, by the way. So I share that because it's a common experience we have with folks that don't seem to follow, I guess, the train of conversation that we would normally be expecting, and then have no tolerance for mistakes along the way, right? They just don't. At the end of the session, by the way, the person basically said, I'm so sorry. Can we please schedule again for next week? Yeah, of course. And then the last subtype, self-destructive, very common presentation to clinic settings, to hospitals, right? This is the person with perpetual vacillation. They vent their anger, what's called intro-punitively. This means I don't punch you in the face when I'm mad. I punch me in the face when I'm mad. I take it out on myself. That internalization of anger is, of course, what comes out as, self-injurious behavior, suicidal thinking, and maybe even attempts. These folks do have a strong fear of autonomy, this idea of living independently, which is a core goal for DBT, by the way, really, really is scary for them. They try to please others through deferential and ingratiating behaviors, but they don't perceive reciprocity. They'll scratch my back, but I never scratch theirs in turn. So now all of a sudden they feel awful about themselves. There's something not right with them. They love me for doing what I do, but they hate me too. And they don't know what to do with that. So they intro punitively harm, right? Self-harm and suicide. Now, we need to be aware that borderline personality is also pretty well known for common comorbidities. And when you look at these, you've got some pretty high risk stuff here. Substance use and eating disorders being really, really high risk stuff. Mood disorders like bipolar disorder can be very high risk. Those moving up to manic and then coming down from very risky places for folks to be in. Post-traumatic stress disorder, without over pumping this point, there's co-occurrence, but our talking today, borderline personality, absolutely exists in the absence of any identified trauma in the person's life. One is not simply subsumed by the other. They exist, and they often will exist together. If you think about Milan subtypes, or even just the DSM, you can clearly see this is a group of folks whose way of being in the world may well predispose them to having life experiences that would in fact be traumatic. The ADHD spectrum, and then the co-occurrence of other personality disorder features and disorders too. One way I like to conceptualize all of personality stuff, by the way, is not siloed, discrete entities. It is continuum based. More often than not, you see people have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and oh yeah, they met, full criteria for that one, but there's still this stuff here from that diagnosis. That happens really frequently. Again, people are nuanced and complex, and this is why the criteria from DSM is so important. Adaptive inflexibility, long-standing, right? Often starts in childhood, but that is not a requirement, interestingly, for most. What are the approaches to working? Well, number one, you got to assess these comorbid conditions and plan to treat them. Integrated care is optimal. You're talking about minimizing some of the more difficult behaviors that you might find with someone with borderline personality, which could be, a bit of the black and white thinking and splitting of providers. So the more succinctly you can get their treatment down to one or two people, the better off the whole work is going to be. Now, that doesn't mean that the individual should only have a therapist and not a case manager, different roles. I'm speaking directly from the direct care clinical experience. Do integrated care as much as you possibly can. Individual, group, psychiatry, case management, all very good interventions for these folks, primarily because of the next point, assessing risk and prioritizing safety planning when needed. Now, again, according to Milan, only the one subtype is really dangerous. The other three typically do not have that presentation. So when you get the heuristic diagnosis from a brief inpatient stay, someone who's never been inpatient before, they go in for suicidal ideation or an attempt, and they come back out with a diagnosis of, bipolar disorder and borderline personality. That can't be done. It just can't, but I know we see it. Okay, so maybe there is evidence, maybe someone saw that person for 5 or 6 days, and maybe they got some family background history, and the person described some of their history. But frankly, I don't find that a very helpful diagnosis. It seems to me that what you're really wanting to be more focused on is what was the function of the behavior? How do I assess and manage the risk and make sure I'm safety planning with that person as best as I can? And that can often be a lot of what a colleague of mine will call high touch, right? So you're seeing the person once a week, they're in group once a week, you've got a case manager, recovery coach, whatever else they need. Now their psychiatrist is seeing them regularly, so like every month or whatever. So a lot of frequent contact with that individual. I absolutely encourage family engagement for a variety of reasons. One, I like family systems therapy to start, but I like multiple perspectives. I like seeing how people interact differently with different people. A good example of that might be this. I was seeing a family a few years ago, and they had a child who had just come out of CPC with a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. He was too young for me to see individually, but we all agreed to meet as a family. So I'm watching the family interactional system, So it's a mom, dad, and a child. And on occasion, one of the other children will come too. And I'm watching these interactional things happen. And by no means could I arrive at the conclusion that the child had the diagnosis that he was given by CPC, who had seen him for 6 months, inpatient, long term. I'm thinking, well, I'm just seeing different things. But I started to wonder what that might be about. So I asked mom where the diagnosis came from, and it came from an inpatient stay prior to going to CPC, which then had not changed. And in 6 months, the child had been doing DBT, and it wasn't working. And the family was just really struggling with this because it was the preferred, treatment modality, and the child kept, rejecting and rejecting and rejecting. I said, well, what if it's actually because this individual actually is presenting with symptoms of antisocial personality and, narcissistic personality? Now, we walked through symptoms. I didn't just dump that on them. So I got to fast forward to that point to make the point. In family systems, you're going to see a checking of presentation, right? So this individual couldn't turn on and off things about himself without the parents checking him and saying, hey, that's not true, or that's not a reflection of what really happened. He didn't have that luxury whereas that could be done in other settings where family isn't present. It is why I love part of having family involved. Plus, you get history. DBT, this is dialectical behavioral therapy. It is the gold standard working with borderline personality. So absolutely get trained in that, become facile with it. We'll talk in detail about it, but let's sidebar to manipulation in a sec. Another great treatment modality, by the way, is what's called Jeff Young's schema therapy. It's probably even more, call it client-centered than DBT would be, because the language is really engaging to just the general population, you know, reading about schemas about yourself as opposed to disorders and, you know, features and this like high clinical language. Jung avoids that by talking about more naturalistic language that describes an experience of being in the world. So this is right out of Linehan, by the way. I steal lots of stuff for these presentations. I'm not by in any way claiming original thought. But let's talk about how Linehan looked at manipulation. It came from her early work with borderline personality females in an inpatient setting. So she was doing research, which meant she was doing pre-testing, intervention, post-testing. And in her post-testing, she was asking some interesting questions. One being, what do you find to be maybe the most difficult thing to tolerate about your outpatient therapist? Some version of that question, right? And she said that one of the responses that she got back the most often was about being accused of manipulating, and that some people would even go so far as to say, you know, like, how self-centered do you have to be as my therapist to think that I think about you when I'm not sitting with you? Like, wow, that's really kind of insulting, you know. And Linehan thought a lot about that and kept looking at the phenomenon of what is manipulation. So why don't we just get the dictionary and define it? Manipulation is a pre-planned or cunning attempt to get someone to do something they ordinarily would not do, often with nefarious intent. Now, pre-planned and cunning. Think about the symptom presentation of borderline personality. Pre-planned and cunning for someone who's paradoxically, interpersonally paradoxical, emotionally labile, right? Impulsive. These folks are the definition of in the moment. Like, they almost can't get out of the moment. And it keeps changing. Every moment just keeps going so fast. They can't keep up. These are not the folks that sit back and are highly reflective and play out long cons. They can't do short cons. It's impulsivity is the problem. And then Linehan arrived at this beautifully succinct way of describing what might really be happening. She said, it is a logical fallacy to assume that because you feel a certain way, the other person intended for you to feel that way. When the person I sat with said, you know, there's only 5 people in all of Buffalo qualified and you're not one of them, I felt attacked by that, but she wasn't attacking. She was trying to say, Chris, you're misunderstanding me. I'm feeling misunderstood right now. I don't know if this is working. That's how she communicated that to me. And I missed that by a country mile. So what does Marcia say about DBT? The chief dialectic is where you start. Validate and hold out the expectation for change. It would have been so much more effective of me to say, you know, to this person, hey, I clearly see you're upset. You know, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to miss what you were trying to say there. Let me ask you to maybe just dial the intensity down for a sec, because I got to admit, I got a little defensive, you know, but I don't want that to be a focus. The chief dialectic, validate, hold out the expectation for change. Mindfulness. This is the real core of what DBT is. You know, teaching folks about wise mind, being an emotion mind, rational mind, or balance the two. And what does that mean? Most times we want to have a nice balance of how we're thinking and feeling, but not always. There are simply times when we want to be in high emotion mind. When I go to a comedy club, I don't want to be in my rational mind and be overthinking the jokes. I want to be almost all in emotion mind, not thinking about the illogic, but just finding the funny in what I'm experiencing. You're going to teach these folks distress tolerance skills, interpersonal effectiveness skills, emotion regulation skills, formal and informal, meaning there are simply many models of DBT as applied in the real world. Formal DBT is highly, highly structured and includes things that many therapists in the world may not be able to incorporate into the practice, like phone coaching, which means you're available 24/7 for a like 2-3 minute phone call for people that you are engaging in DBT. So there's more modified versions where you're introducing Marcia Linehan's treatment protocols and ideas, maybe even her workbook or her group protocols. And that can be done inpatient, outpatient. The modifications for DBT, frankly, really are just about what are you able to offer. Your goals in working with these folks: one, you got to start with your supportive, empathic stance. If there are past traumas, be fully aware of that, because that's going to need treatment, most likely. If it's presenting, right, it may well be stabilized from a previous treatment episode, but that doesn't mean it can't recur. Connecting the past to the present when tolerable. These are treatment goals. Being aware that their own poor self-image aggravates the problem. They do things which can be counterproductive to what they think they're trying to accomplish. Clearly establishing the goal of independent functioning at the beginning of treatment. This, to some degree, is about avoiding maybe behaviors at the end of treatment that make treatment go on because the person's afraid of ending something with you. But you're trying to teach what's called responsible autonomy. Always maintaining nice, firm boundaries with folks. You want to be good, clear role models. A lot of folks with borderline personality struggle very, very much with boundaries, what they are. They perceive a boundary as punishment for them, not self-care for you often. So we have to teach that. A boundary is a limit I set for myself, which I understand can be perceived as painful to you, but that's not the intention of the boundary. That needs to be defined. Start treatment with short-term achievable goals. We don't want to jump right into, the sexiness of like family of origin processing. What is the goal to be achieved there, right? It's hard to describe. We want to have folks find success in therapy with increase this, decrease that, clear connection to progress in treatment. It gives people a sense of efficacy, of a belief in therapy working for them. Then you want to do some mid to long-term goals, meaning, yes, family of origin, cognitive restructuring stuff, trauma recapitulation when that's appropriate. As Judith Herman would say, like the remembrance and mourning phase of trauma. We're also helping these folks identify their paradoxical interpersonal conduct. So, for example, an individual I worked with many years ago would show up to a clinic wearing, the big old like can headphones. Back when those were not a thing, they weren't cool back then. Bagpipe music. Always wore the same kind of like dress, which was unintentionally provocative. The person would come in and have a big old backpack, and put the backpack in one chair next to her and swing one chair out in the middle of like the floor here and put her feet up on that chair. It drew enormous amounts of attention to her. The exact thing she was non-verbally trying to avoid. She didn't want people sitting next to her. She didn't want people around her. And paradoxically, it drew all that attention to her. Had to help her see that, because of course she's going to look up and make a comment to someone, which is going to create a conflict, right? So we had to work through that a little bit. Okay, a lot. Group is an excellent opportunity because I think folks learning from one another is a really powerful experience. And the idea that we can all talk about where we've fallen down and no one's going to judge us for having done that, and we can all learn together how to try new things. It's not just coming from some authority. Self-care. Ending here with self-care. By no means is implied to be the lowest of the priorities. I think it's frankly the highest. So we have to start with caseload management and understanding that the heuristic of borderline to describe the wide array of difficult people is a realistic thing, and people use the language, I think, as a way of self-validating that I'm dealing with a difficult person. So there is gallows humor about, oh my goodness, that person is so borderline-y. Self-care is avoiding that rabbit hole though as much as possible. Back out of that, emotion place, find the place of rational within you and think to yourself, about what best describes what I'm just experiencing there. And it's not that, we can't have our moment of gallows humor. We're all going to do that. Just don't overindulge in it, because you're going to make a mistake in terms of eventually maybe creating something for yourself, working with these folks that might just not be helpful for you. At the end of the day, again, caseload management is about risk assessment. Borderline is not borderline, is not borderline. I have the luxury where I work, my practice is a largely low risk practice by definition, because of the populations I like to work with. So I can't have a lot of high risk and still work with the populations that, get referred to me. I wouldn't have the time to manage it. So you've got to have that like math in your head a little bit. If you love working with this population, even the more self-destructive subtypes, that's outstanding for you. Just know that's going to limit your caseload. You might only be able to see 20 or 25 people, where a colleague could be having a wider variety of 50, 60. You simply won't have the ability to do it because of how much risk you're going to be managing. And if you just don't want to have that much risk on your caseload, because you do need to be seeing other people, make sure you're managing that as best you can. Greg Lester, who's a national trainer on personality disorders, does a lot of work on what he calls drama. Drama is defined by him as a triangle with 3 points: rescuer, victim, persecutor. And I say, look into this stuff, because it really is normalizing when you're interacting with people to see how people tend to live in drama roles, meaning people with personality issues tend to live in drama roles as opposed to social roles. So, they're heroes, they're not fathers, right? They're the good guy, they're not brothers. They live in these existential roles. You need to find one that balances these drama roles. It's called the scientific observer. Interactionally, you're just observing, describing, but what you're not doing is becoming part of the drama experiment. We need to resist feeling victimized by the antisocial personality that says stuff or steals from us and, that attacks us. I needed to learn how to not get defensive when I felt this individual, challenging my credential. Like, who am I to care if she does? Like, I had to find that place to be neutral, observe, describe, and be in that moment with her in order to help. Using supervision, super important. Borderline personality is probably the most common clinical topic that comes up in my experience. In individual supervision, for me as a supervisee and as a supervisor, whether individual or group. It's a topic people want to talk about and look at a lot. And again, I think it's because of this radical inconsistency out in the world with how one term describes so many subtypes. It just doesn't match, our experience working with people. So using supervision to help parse that out a little bit can be very, very helpful. Learn as much as you can about the phenomenon and about fly fishing. Why? Because life is not work. Work is hopefully what we do to have life, and we need to have, other things that we think about, other passions in the world. Be passionate about this. I certainly am, but I'm equally passionate about fly fishing and virtual reality, and it's just the world is too broad to get stuck with one thing. Remember to not personalize this stuff. Believe me, they're not. But your feelings are natural and normal. They're your tool. Be prepared for requests for self-disclosure, by the way. In my view, it's generally metaphorical. Someone just wants to know if you are willing to engage in a conversation that isn't just about them. So if you are tempted, and I have in my career, I've simply stopped doing it, to say some version of this is about you, not about me, I highly encourage to not use versions of that phrase, particularly with this population. They perceive it as a punch in the face, as you're better than me. Find another way to address and deflect, if you're not comfortable, but be prepared. People are just people and are curious, Hey, Chris, do you have kids? I do. Thanks for asking, man. Tell me about your kids. There's nothing wrong with that. It's human. But if I say this is about you, not about me, guess who I'm never going to see again? I wouldn't go back to that guy. Like, people are just people. We got to remember that, right? Be consistent. Be a good role model. Find the funny. Yes, within session, we're not making fun of people, but this is about finding, adaptive cognitive ways of viewing things. How can we take something that's painful now and remember grandma's advice when we were little kids. Chris, don't worry. One day you're going to look back on this and laugh. I probably say that several times a week to people because it's real. It's not funny now, so I'm not going to minimize it. But I'm going to remind you that this is not a permanent state. It will adapt. It will change, evolve. But we have to make that happen. So self-care is about finding funny in the world. Oh, and that is right up to the end. So it looks like we've got a few minutes for questions if there are any.
Feel free to type in your questions. No questions yet, but someone did have a comment, Chris. They said, Marsha Linehan did postdoctoral work at Crisis Services here in Buffalo and was an adjunct professor at UB.
Oh, no kidding. Wow. Cool. I did not know that.
No other questions that I see yet.
Kathleen, do you want to do a quick exercise in finding the funny?
Sure.
I'm going to thank you ahead of time. There's nothing really, I was here once before with the group and Kathleen volunteered to do a joke with me, and thank you. This is not that though. This is about helping people find alternative ways of thinking about things, right? So to do that, I'm going to show you my ball gag. Is that okay?
Sure.
My ball gag. All right. You see my ball? My baseball?
Yeah.
All right. So Kathleen, what I'm going to do is I'm going to toss this ball up into the air, okay? I just want you to count 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, like how long is the ball up in the air for? And then I'm going to ask you to estimate maybe how far it traveled, okay?
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to toss the ball. It's going to go up off the screen, probably land back in my hand, hope if I can catch it. Here we go.
Okay.
About a second, maybe?
Yep.
Okay, so in that 1 second, how far do you figure that ball traveled?
2 feet.
So 2 feet in a second. What if I said to you that ball actually traveled 18 miles and I can prove it?
Sure, prove it.
Okay, so you got that curiosity on your face. That's great. That means you are in a place of being curious, wondering, thinking about adaptive cognitive flexibility. So if this ball, let's say this ball is now the sun, okay? And my fist is the earth, and the earth is moving around the sun like this, right? That takes 365 days. So the math of that means the earth is moving at 18 miles per second. So that means the ball just traveled 18 miles in that 1 second, as did you and me and our computers. Like everything moved, traveled 18 miles in that 1 second. Now, that is about the ability to understand the black and white thinking is not the way to be in the world. It's almost always multiple answers to any question. It's about our own ability to be creative within that. And to find the funny in it, I don't know, it might not have just landed. But when I call that my ball gag, I always get a weird look from people like, what's he about to do? Like, no way, I don't know if I'm going to do this anymore. It's just a ball, right? So finding it funny, but using it to illustrate a point. And I do this with clients all the time. Little examples like that, little games, just to illustrate points. In other words, talk therapy isn't just about talk. His ability to be with people and demonstrate these kind of concepts. I mean, people really connect to that kind of thing. Anyway, just, I guess, to waste the last 5 minutes of our time.
It just looks like one quick question, if you have a minute. It says, why do they not want to diagnose personality disorders or mood swings too young?
Why?
I think it can cause more damage, actually, the person said.
Yeah, what was the full question? Why do they
not want to diagnose personality disorders or mood swings too young?
Okay. I'm not quite sure like who the they would be. I know for me, psychologists will say they can start identifying personality disorders around age 5. right? And if you think about age 5 in our culture, well, it's an interesting transition point where a child is going largely from one social domain to a much larger social domain. So many other people are seeing behaviors that the family simply might have normalized to. So kids can be diagnosed that young. I don't know how common that occurs. I'll be straight up. I don't work with kids that young and never have. So I don't have a whole lot of awareness of the research. But I think there would be a natural resistance to wanting to diagnose formally that young for a couple of reasons. One, developmental changes. If you've had teenagers or remember being a teenager, well, you know, like these symptoms, you're gonna see like there's a joke about all teenagers are borderline. Like there's a little phase that many of us go through that feels like that. But this is why you need the long-standing component of the diagnosis. So relative to a child, what would long-standing even reflect back to? Like I think there would be real difficulty in establishing a diagnosis. So hopefully that answered the question.
Okay, well, we're at our time. Thank you, Chris. That was wonderful. Thank you, Kathleen, for monitoring the chat.
Sure.
And thank you all for participating today. I did paste the link for the evaluation in the chat box and ask you to take a moment to complete that for us. I also posted the link for the March session, which will be Problem Gambling 101, and that offers a free continuing ed credit. I encourage you to mark your calendars for future sessions. They're all on the 4th Tuesday of the month from noon to 1. We'll be sending out notices for future sessions, and you can also check the erie.gov/mental health website for announcements and to check out all of the past presentations, including this one, which will be posted within the week, and Chris's previous presentation, which was in November, and that was awesome too. Again, if you're interested in being a presenter, please let me know. You can include that on the evaluation, or if you have a topic you'd like to know more about. Chris, that was wonderful. Thank you so very much. I hope to have you back again. And for everyone, thank you all for being here and participating in our collaborative. Have a great day, and we will see you next month.